rotten hooker.
The very lies the serpent told to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote.
Hey everybody, it's Thursday, May 5th. This is the episode of This Non-Religious Life, and today we're going to be answering some emails we've received. Believe it or not, we're already starting to get emails with comments and suggestions for topics, so why not hop right into those?
I think that's awesome.
Me too. This is our third episode. We're already getting emails. So I'm your host, Ken. With me, we have Jason.
Hello.
And Bob.
How's it going?
And the first email concern, someone was asking, what about the shroud that was found in the tomb that the scientists can't disprove? And this is, for listeners who might not know what they're talking about, they're talking about the Shroud of Turin. This is supposedly the burial cloth that Jesus was wrapped in. And there's an image of him in the cloth. And I know Bob has some strong opinions of this.
Well, I think it's funny that it's brought up, like, oh, well, what about this? Because I think this was an issue that was sort of put to bed almost 10 years ago, and now it just keeps cropping up. And so, I mean, it's all right, fair enough. We'll talk about it. You know, we'll examine, you know, what the arguments are and who says what and whether it's good evidence or bad evidence. We'll dissect it a little bit. But yeah, so do we want to jump right in on the shroud?
Yeah, I mean, we have a little video. It goes over some of the points that people make about the shroud. So we'll jump right into the first point that he's going to make.
The shroud was carried from the tomb of Jesus by Peter and taken to Edessa, Turkey. The shroud was lost and wasn't rediscovered till 944 when a Byzantine emperor sent an army to bring it to Constantinople.
All right, so that's the first point. And I think, it's such a weak point to start off with. It's like, oh, there was this shroud that people talk about, and then it was, you know, lost for 900 years. And that's like, if I lose a pen here in Sam's, and someone 3 years from now finds a pen sitting under a table, what's the chance that it's my pen?
Not very good at all, I would say. I agree. It's a weak point.
But that's only saying if everybody carried around a pen with them, or if everybody carried around a shroud with them.
Well, everyone dies at some point.
But that's a very good point, though, because there are no less than 40 other medieval shrouds which have claimed to be the death shroud of Jesus Christ. There are 40 of them. 39 of them don't have an image of a person on them, but neither necessarily did the Edessa shroud. I mean, okay, yeah, sure, maybe somebody had something at that time, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily it. And we're talking a span of almost 1,000 years. That's a long time. I mean, a long time for no record of anything else to exist,
yeah,
even
seriously.
if you allow that that's it.
Well, exactly. Stretch out the idea that I lose my pen in here for 3 years to 900 years, and then assume that it's... But that's the nature of relics, right? I mean, there are relics all over the place. There's a relic somewhere that claims to be the foreskin of Jesus from when he was circumcised.
Well, yeah, and we're also talking about...
I want that on
period
my
of time.
man.
But we're entering, when we enter the medieval era, that's a period of time when relics were huge. There was relic mongering going on, and I'm not accusing any one particular person of perpetrating a hoax or saying something that isn't true. But there's a common saying among skeptics that there's enough wood of the one true cross to make a ship, and enough nails from the one true cross to nail it all together. So which is true, and this period of time was rife with charlatanism and hoaxing. I mean, who can say what was real and what wasn't?
Even if the shroud is an authentic death shroud and not like a complex forgery, simply saying that I found this death shroud, it has to be Jesus's. That's like saying if I went to England and found a sword that I found Excalibur.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's okay. Yeah, sure.
If it was laying next to the stone,
there may have been something in 944 AD or CE, or however you want to measure it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's it.
Yeah, exactly. So, with that, we're going to jump into his second claim.
By Segunda P in 1898. And he was shocked to find when he took the pictures that the negative image was a positive image. And Barry Schwartz, who's actually Jewish, he's the shroud documenting photographer, he says this, quote, assuming that the shroud were manufactured in the 14th century, it would mean that someone would have had to conceive the concept of photography approximately 650 years before it was invented. I don't think so, end quote.
Okay. It's absolutely true that in 1898, the guy photographed the shroud, and his name was Secundo Pia, and he looked at the negative images, and he said, wow, this is, if I take the negative image of the shroud, it makes a positive image. So they liken it to a photograph. But here's the thing about that negative image. It's not a true negative image. And the easiest thing to point out would be the beard and his hair. Had it been a true negative, those would have been dark spots on the negative image instead of light spots. So among photographic experts, the negative image on the Shroud of Turin is regarded as a quasi-negative image. It is not a true negative image. What it most resembles is an image if it was like a relief laid over something and a rubbing was taken of it.
I think that's more what it is too, right there. It's a rubbing. But even if it was a negative image, I mean, saying, "Oh my God, it's a negative image," they would have to have known about photography. No, they wouldn't have. Negative images in art go back, I mean, thousands of years. You know, the Greeks painted negative images onto pottery. I mean, it's such a willful ignorance of art history to say there were no negative images before the advent of photography.
Yeah. So, one, to say that it's a negative image isn't true, and two, it overlooks the fact that negative images did indeed exist before this time.
Yeah, definitely. And so we're going to hop into the third point, which has to do with what the shroud is made of.
Professor Reyes Louvain found in the shroud linen microscopic bits of cotton under the microscope. And not just plain cotton, but cotton with a certain number of twists per centimeter. We have to realize that cotton has a different number of twists per centimeter depending upon what country it's from. And cotton grown over here, for example, has 20 to 25 twists, and cotton grown over in the Middle East has 8 to 10 twists, and the cotton found in the shroud has about 8 twists per centimeter, so it fits exactly the kind of cotton that's in the Middle East. And cotton isn't even grown commercially in Europe.
Oh my God, the cotton wasn't grown in the United States region, like that's now Virginia, because at best the shroud dates to 300 years before the discovery of the New World.
Well, the only legitimate provenance of the shroud is when it turns up around 1357, and it's the property of a crusade knight, and his name was what was his name?
It was Savoy, wasn't it?
It was but anyway, he was a crusade knight, so he was in the Middle East. He could have easily brought back any fabric he wanted to.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. In the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, it's not like cotton was uncommon in Europe. Like, those areas had been opened up for trade since the First Crusade in the beginning of the 12th century. Like, in 1101, there was the Minor Crusade, or 1090 was the First Crusade. That whole area was opened up to Europe for trade. Of course, like, cotton grown in the Middle East would be making it over into France and England. I mean, during that time, shortly before, Jerusalem was essentially a vassal state, but it was it was a European-ruled kingdom.
Well, the question I have, I mean, because I just don't know, is who did the burial, I guess, like for a better term, ceremony to lay a shroud over the body of Jesus when he was put in the tomb? Who did that? Was that the Romans? Was that the apostles? Was who?
I believe traditionally it's Joseph of Arimathea. He was a follower of Jesus, and he was fairly wealthy. And he normally crucified bodies would be stuck in a common grave for 1 year, and then they would be pulled out and they would be able to be put in their family ossuaries. Joseph of Arimathea essentially paid the Romans to allow him to take Jesus' body and put it in his family plot rather than the common grave. And then they would have anointed the body and stuck it away, wrapped in linen.
So since he was wealthy, that linen could have come from anywhere as well. There's not a traditional from this family that did this would have a traditional shroud. Like if his grandmother was not crucified but died, she would be wrapped in it or laid with a shroud as well.
Yeah.
So the fabric between his family and the fabric that was laid over Jesus would be similar, you think?
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because there's an interesting argument against the Shroud of Turin based on the fabric itself, the weave. We have a death shroud from either a high priest or a member of the high priest's family from the 1st century in Jerusalem, and the weave pattern for the burial shroud is incredibly, it's just a simple, two-way weave. Whereas the Shroud of Turin is a much more complicated, I believe it's a 3-in-1 twill weave, which is way more difficult to produce, and at the time wasn't being produced in and around Jerusalem. I mean, it was being produced in the 1st century, but you would have had to go to, into Syria or into Egypt to find it. And Egypt is... will come up later on with another one of his points. But I think with this point, again, I mean, it's just not... This is nothing, very, conclusive at all.
Well, it's anomaly hunting. Find something anomalous. Oh, this must be divine. And that's not necessarily... That doesn't mean that there's not a good explanation for it.
Yeah, I agree. So... speaking of anomalies, we're going to go right into another one, and this is about the dirt found on the shroud itself.
Flowers. They've also found dirt on the footprint of the cloth, and this dirt has been found to come from Jerusalem's Damascus Gate and nowhere else. And
nowhere else. I love it. It's this dirt that's on here is found at this one specific small tiny region of one area next to a certain part of a wall in a city, and it's such absolute crap because the dirt found on it is Travertine aragonite limestone, which can be found everywhere. Travertine can be found at Yellowstone National Park. The Jupiter Terrace Fountain Geyser Pool at Yellowstone is made of travertine. Travertine is found all over the Middle East. I mean, there are quarries in Italy that pull this exact same stone out, and that's the kind of dirt. Yes, you can find it near Jerusalem, but you can find it in tons of other places all around the world.
We're going to get into this in a little bit, but I would also... There's some controversy around just the nature of the research that was done on the shroud, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But just because they find an anomalous soil sample on it doesn't necessarily mean that that's where it has to come from, and there can be no other explanation.
Yeah, I agree.
But why are they trying to say that this? Why are they pinpointing this type of dirt or soil?
Well, because the dirt does exist near Jerusalem. So they're saying that this dirt is native to Jerusalem, therefore that's where the shroud had to come from. Because the dirt came off the body. So the body that was laying in it was covered in that sort of dirt. And the limestone caves that some of these ossuaries and family vaults were in were cut out of the same sort of stone. But what's really funny is as I was listening to this earlier today, I thought, like, this same stone could be found in the New World. Does that mean the Mormons are right? Maybe the dirt's just from Jesus walking around at Yellowstone Park when he came over to talk to the Indians here.
It's certainly not conclusive proof. I mean, just because it happens to match one geographic locale doesn't mean that it couldn't necessarily match another geographic locale. And that it's one of those things where it gets held up as this can only be the one explanation.
Yeah. With that, we're going to jump into his next argument, and this is about an imprint of a coin on the face of the shroud.
It's also a Jewish custom when people die to put coins over the eyes when laying the corpse out for burial. And in the test that they did, examining the Shroud of Turin, it looks like there's a coin over one of the eyes, the right eye. And this coin has 24 coincidences with a coin called the lepton, which was put out by Pontius Pilate between 29 and 36 AD. And when you look at this coin, you notice the staff. Remember the staff and the letters UKAI. And now we're going to look at the shroud, reproducing it closer and closer, larger and larger. And under high magnification, Father Philos found this. You can see the staff and the letters UCAI. And Father Philos was shocked to see this. But he wondered why there was a C instead of a K. But in 1981, at the British Museum, he found two coins that had a C instead of a K.
Okay, two things annoy me about that. One is that he says U, and it's not a U. It's a nu. It's an N. And I mean, just the ignorance of the fact that that's Greek and not Latin annoys me when he's trying to make a point about this.
I doubt the very veracity that it's even there.
Yeah. It's definitely picking out spots and being like, oh, look at these four little dots.
That's pareidolia. That's looking at white noise and finding what you want in it. In all the research I did, none of the even the very hardcore skeptical researchers for the shroud, the coin is not even mentioned. That's not even regarded among shroud researchers. The Shroud Research Group, the STURP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, they don't even acknowledge the coin in the eye. That's not even evidence that they've considered. And they're the officially sanctioned research group by the Vatican.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. And, I mean, like, he's obviously just, like, picking at points. And he's like, oh, see this, the K instead of a C, but there is no C in Greek. There isn't. Like, there is no letter C in Greek. The closest thing you can get is in Coptic, which is only spoken in Egypt. Their letter sigma, which is normally an S, is written as a C rather than as what we normally see as a sigma.
I mean, you can pick apart their scholarship, but I think at the end of the day, that it's just pareidolia. I mean, it is literally shapes in clouds. I can look in there and find the whole alphabet if I tried and looked hard enough.
Definitely. It really is like, I was dumbfounded when I saw that. I was like, I'm looking, I literally just like tilted my head as I'm looking at my screen, looking at like these letters. And I was like, those are really just dots.
Yeah, that is a real stretch. That's the biggest stretch. And like I said, even the Shroud of Turin Research Project, the officially sanctioned group that's their mission directive is from the Vatican itself. They don't even acknowledge that evidence.
Yeah. So, coin debunked, I think. We're going to jump into his next comment, which is about how the form's legs aren't broken and there's other forensic details. So,
the body on the shroud is not even straight. The abdomen appears swollen, showing that the cause of death was suffocation. The legs on the shroud are not broken, and the Romans who crucified their victims always broke the legs of the crucified. And this goes back to Exodus 12:46, where it says that they wouldn't break a bone in his body. the blood flows. We have to realize that when you're crucified, the hands fall to a 25-65 degree angle, and so the blood flows a certain way, and it's exactly, the blood flows on the shroud showed that it was of a man who was crucified.
Okay. First of all, I want to point out the fact that a swollen stomach is not evidence of asphyxiation. I am not a forensic pathologist at all, but I was searching. I've never heard of that, and I mean, I've watched a lot of,
CSI.
CSI. But honestly, like I was searching through like forensics and forensic pathology websites all day trying to find if a bloated stomach is evidence of asphyxiation. The only thing I found is that certain swelling in the abdomen can occur if you drown, but that's it.
In my looking at this, when they look at the figure in the shroud, it's always, everybody always points that it's congruent with the Gothic representation of Christ at the time.
It really
everything
is.
About it is, and even down to the hair, the beard, the mustache, everything about it is just a congruent with the medieval Gothic representation of Christ. And I read something where they were. I forget, it was probably Joe Nickel that said it, that, around 400 AD, nobody knew what Jesus looked like. There was no record of his appearance. And then suddenly there's this tradition of depicting him as a thin, bearded man with long hair. And then that tradition stuck, and that became the way that everybody did it. And this just follows right along.
Exactly. If you pull up a picture, and for all the listeners, do this. Like, stop the video when you get a chance, like if you're watching a rerun, and just go Google The Last Supper by Da Vinci, and like look at Jesus.
You don't have to stop the video.
and compare them. I mean, compare any of the old masters or anything like that. All of the old medieval depictions of Jesus as a long-haired, bearded man. He looks identical to the shroud.
One of the sites I read that was sort of advocating for the authenticity of it, they were talking about if this really was a representation of a person, there would be a person that's very tall, very thin, elongated limbs, large chest, and nobody looks like that. And then somebody made the special pleading argument like, oh, well, that's because Jesus had Marfan syndrome. Which that's the only way that you would have that sort of physiological build, and that. And I was like, oh, come on, that's special pleading.
Yeah, I mean, I want to address the broken legs thing, because this is really interesting, and this ties into an argument about how this was recreated, and in 2009 there was a professor. Oh God, what was his name?
It's like Gerleshi or something like that.
Yeah, Luigi Gersheli or something like that. And he's the professor of organic chemistry at some university in Europe. I forget which one. But he successfully reproduced the shroud by taking a person and wrapping them in the shroud, and then putting a simple organic acid-based pigment over the shroud and letting it sit. And then he pulled it off him, and he baked it, and then he just touched it up with tempera paint for where the blood is, because tempera paint is iron-based, same as hemoglobin. And literally, all the 3D rendering, all the negative image, so-called, it was all identical. He made a perfect representation of this. And, I mean, the fact that his legs weren't broken, Jesus' legs weren't broken, that just means the model for this didn't have his legs broken, lucky enough for him.
Yeah, the fact that something isn't there is not good evidence for the way it should be. I don't know. I don't buy that argument either.
Yeah. The blood flow argument is the last thing I want to address here, and that's it should be noted that the shroud was put on Jesus post-mortem.
Yeah.
There is no bleeding post-mortem. When you die, your blood pressure drops to 0 and bleeding stops. So saying the blood flow from the wounds is a completely moot point, because you don't bleed after you're dead. Jesus was dead well before they pulled him off the cross, let alone when they wrapped him in the shroud and stuck him in the tomb.
So, if you believe the story.
If you believe the story. And that's what I'm saying. I'm arguing this from the point of, I'll grant you one point. that maybe Jesus died on the cross. But this shroud is a load of crap. We're going to jump to his last point that we're going to address today. And this is about the fact that it's a relic and it's gruesome.
Right.
Opinion beyond dispute. And the other question is, why would anyone keep this kind of relic, so gruesome a relic, unless it was the true burial cloth of Jesus Christ?
That's the non sequitur.
It's totally a red herring. It's so ridiculous. It's like, well, it's gruesome, so it has to be real. The Middle Ages were, I mean, we've said it before. The Middle Ages, and this is nothing compared to relics. Like the relic of the head of John the Baptist, or like the arm of Saint Xavier, the foot of Saint Xavier. Someone bit the toe off of, and like this is
pretty gruesome relics.
Relics in and of themselves are typically, like I said before, Jesus' foreskin. You know, they're
lovely.
This is not a gruesome relic, and even if it were, gruesome was sort of like that was the yardstick by which you measured relics in the Middle Ages.
So, I'd like to talk about the modern science that's been done on the shroud, and this is the part where I thought this was pretty conclusively put to bed. So, in the 70s, there was a group of scientists and research that they were commissioned by the Vatican. And they were called the acronym is STURP, STURP, and they were the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And their job was to go in and scrutinize the shroud and find whatever evidence there was and sort of bring the light of science to bear on this. And the first problem that I have with this is that all of them were they were all Catholics. They were all believers. So they're doing science sort of backwards. You know, they're starting from a conclusion and trying to find evidence that goes that way, rather than follow the evidence wherever it may lead. And there happened to be one of their members, and his name is Walter McCrone, and he found a lot of damning evidence for the shroud, and he was the guy that has sort of conclusively shown that the image is due to red tempera paint, and he says, you know, look, it's not blood, it's iron oxide, and you know, he's the one that has demonstrated that it's a painting, it's a well constructed forgery.
Well,
and he was drummed out of the group. Because he had conflicting evidence. They kicked him out of STURP. And then after he was gone, then they get another guy to come in, and this guy is Max Fry. And Max Fry did this project where they used sticky tape, and they basically just, you know, took samples all over the shroud, and then they examined whatever came off of him. And Max Fry, he came up with this analysis where he said, oh, look, there's 27 different kinds of pollen on these tapes that was present on the shroud, and all of that pollen had to have come from Jerusalem, because they're all special, you know, flowering plants that pollinate in Jerusalem and not in Europe where the shroud was. And everybody said, see, it had to come from Europe. But then it turns out Max Fry, his credibility is zero. He was the guy that authenticated Hitler's diaries, and then he's wrong. Like his scientific rigor is poor at best, and his credibility is zero. And then Walter McCrone went and looked at the very samples that Max Fry took, of the same tape samples, and he the first anomaly, which I hate to use the word anomaly, but the thing that wasn't there was, you would think if there was going to be pollen present on the shroud, that the most common pollen in Jerusalem would be that of the olive tree, not present. And then the pollen that was present, there were samples where there was none, and then there were samples where the pollen looked like lab samples. It was like he had planted evidence. This guy, he was intellectually corrupt enough that the thinking is that he planted evidence to push the conclusion forward. So, you know, the pollen evidence is bad. And then, so then in the 80s, what happened with the shroud was they did carbon dating on it. And carbon dating, you know, the shroud is a holy relic, so it's not like you can take a big chunk of it. They had small samples from the shroud, and they did carbon dating on it. And their carbon dating, they took it to 3 independent labs, and all 3 labs came up with about the same answer, and it put it at about 1357.
Between 1290 and 13 something, yeah.
You know, plus or minus 65 years with 95% certainty. And that was about the same time where the shroud appeared, and everybody was like, well, see, there it is. But then later on, just recently, there's been another guy named Raymond Rogers, and he's published evidence where he's shown, or what he says to show is that the pieces that were used in the carbon dating were not indicative of the whole shroud. And the reason that you have the date of that time is because that particular piece of fabric was dated to a repair that was made to the shroud. And that may be very well so, but the point of the matter is that the carbon dating was published in the journal Accounts of Chemical Research. At the time, that is the second highest, the second most prestigious journal in the world for chemistry. It has an impact factor of 27, I think. So then, now in 2006, when Raymond Rogers, he published his findings in another journal called Thermochemica Acta, which has an impact factor of 1.67, which is not a well-regarded journal. When they say this is peer-reviewed, this is not really peer-reviewed. Impact factor is like how important a journal is. It's a measure of how it's reviewed, how academically rigorous it is. And it turns out that Raymond Rogers, he served on the editorial board for Thermochemica Acta for 20 years. So he published a paper in his own journal. And this gets held up as peer-reviewed evidence, and I think that's a little fishy.
Yeah, definitely. And it's they actually bring up Fry in the video. Well, we skipped over it for the sake of time, but I mean, at this point we should have probably shown it.
Well, there's always next time.
Yeah. And I think those are all great points. Like every single bit of evidence you can bring up for this has been, I mean, thoroughly refuted again and again. I mean, the most they can do, it seems, is point to these random freak occurrences and then ignore out of hand any rigorous scientific data.
Well, I think now the strategy has become, since they can't get any good evidence themselves, then the strategy becomes you cast doubt on the evidence that there is. So, you know, the radiocarbon dating from the 80s, probably really good. And it's very possible that those portions of the shroud that were tested may not have been indicative of the whole thing. That's a very fair assessment. And so what they do is they pursue that argument with the sole purpose of casting doubt.
Mm-hmm. So, what was the last part that we were going to bring up? No, I think that's it. I think we've covered everything for this question. So, to the listener out there, that's our explanation of the shroud.
Wrap it up. Because I know we covered a lot of shit and just about the shroud. So let's wrap it up in a concise view. Starting with you, Ken, then we'll go to Bob. Of what?
Wrap it up in concise.
Yeah, just like, okay, this is what we covered. This is why we. You know.
In general, I mean, from all the evidence that you can pull together from the shroud, it is very likely, and I say this with 99.9% certainty, not authentic. There are so many points where there is such a huge doubt placed, and I hold these arguments to the same rigor that I would hold like a trial. If something was on trial, you know, it needs to be removed completely from any, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt that it is what it claims to be. And I don't see that. There's too many holes. I mean, you have a 900-year gap between supposedly when they had the shroud and now this shroud pops up randomly. There's the planting of evidence, the lack of intellectual honesty when it comes to all the arguments for it being authentic. And there's just a lot of red herrings and special pleading about, certain bits of evidence. They ignore any evidence that comes up. I mean, the best they can do is they can try to cast doubt on what radiocarbon dating is. I always say radiocarbon dating is like a fundamentalist Christian's kryptonite.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's summed up. That's pretty much what I think we covered. Bob, would you say that?
Yeah, I think the Shroud of Turin is an interesting example of possibly the greatest artistic fraud ever perpetrated, and a long-term example of academic fraud. I mean, you've got guys like Max Fry potentially planting evidence, and you have guys printing articles in journals of which they serve on the editorial board, and all to serve the purpose of casting doubt on a religious relic, or casting doubt on the science that refutes a religious relic. And science, it's not that science gets it right all the time, every time. But what happens? Science is a self-correcting process. If there's something wrong with the radiocarbon dating, then fine, let's do it again. Let's take more samples of the shroud. Let's do it again. I'm sure that they'd be all for that, instead of just saying, oh well, hey, here's a reason it could be wrong, so therefore your whole argument is
And that's
wrong.
the thing. They've stopped. They've completely disallowed any more radiocarbon dating of the shroud.
I think that's a little dishonest. That's a what do you call that? Like it's heads I win, tails I win.
Yeah.
Your radiocarbon dating is wrong, so you're wrong. Can't do any more testing. It's the end of the day. That's unfair.
Well, they had their chance. They blew it.
Yeah.
One last thing I wanted to say about it is because we did mention earlier that it's an artistic fraud. It was painted, and people always bring this up, so I'm just going to touch on it very quickly. People will say that, well, it can't be a painting. There's no brushstrokes. The Mona Lisa has no brushstrokes. So.
She doesn't have a smile either.
Yeah. All right. So, the next
Email.
The next email we got was, what about the sealed tomb? And this is in reference to our resurrection challenge. You can go back and check it out. It was episode number 1. And it's, what about the sealed tomb, the guards that watched the tomb, and how they had to break the seal to get into the tomb. And this is a really important point, I think, when I discuss the Bible with people, because I really, really rigorously read the Bible and examine all the arguments, and I have been for several years now. And this is something where the only way you can make an argument about the resurrection is if you take bits and pieces from each gospel and compile them into your own separate account, which is completely dissimilar from all 4 gospels, and it's like no single one of them. And so really quick, we're just going to go over the conflicting accounts of the resurrection. Essentially, in John 20, verses 1 through 13, it's Mary who arrives at the tomb while it's still dark and the stone's moved. She then runs and tells Peter. Peter, and an unnamed disciple run back up to the tomb, and they find 2 angels who explain that Jesus is resurrected. And then Jesus appears to Mary and tells her to go tell the apostles. There is no guard. Not anywhere, not mentioned anywhere.
Well, it says here, well, I guess they don't have references to it. So.
Yeah, they don't have references.
There's a website, riverpower.org, that was sent to us before the show, that it says consider these strong evidence, and talking about the Jesus tomb was secured in 3 ways. 1, a large stone was rolled against it. It talks about it's customary to put the big stone in front of it. It's a size, it weighs the weight of a mid-sized car. That Roman guard units are put in front of it.
Do they have cars?
Consisted.
That's how they had a mid-sized sedan.
They just drove it on.
That's an anachronistic analogy.
Slightly.
Just small. But it says here that they had 4 soldiers that were stationed at the tomb
And this is exactly what I'm talking about right here, because as I go through this, you'll find that what this site is exactly doing is it's cherry picking from each of the 4 Gospels and then saying, well, this was here and this was here and this was here and this was here.
Well, this doesn't even have reference. It doesn't even have points of words.
What it's doing, it's very similar to the Christmas story. You know, growing up, we all know the Christmas story. The Christmas story is very much cherry picked between the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, so that you have bits and pieces from both, but it's dissimilar to both at the same time.
How does the faithful rationalize the internal inconsistencies of the Gospels and still maintain the inerrancy of the Bible?
it's not. It has to do with how you read the Bible. When people read the Bible, you can read it like laterally. You can just start at the beginning and then move to the end. And if you do it this way, what you're going to do is you're going to read a story, and then at some point later on, you're going to read a similar story. You're not going to remember necessarily some of the details, but you're going to remember that, oh, these are similar, right? And you sort of go on. The way any academic reads these scriptures is what they do is they'll have, 2 or 3 versions open to the same story, and then they'll look and they'll list them. Like, if you go through Acts 9 through 15, and you make a chronological list of all the things Paul does and where he goes, and then you flip open to Galatians 1 and 2, and then you go through there, you'll find the lists are completely different. But if you just read the Bible straight through, you're never going to pick up.
Well, I
on
mean,
that.
right, but so sure, right? If you read through the Bible linearly, like you said, I get right. That makes sense. But when you have that side by side comparison, how do people rationalize that?
Well, I don't think most people have that side by side comparison.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, how do biblical scholars rationalize?
Well, that's a thing. When that's the difference between religious studies like biblical scholarship and theology, seminarians. And this is all taught in seminaries, but it seems like a lot of preachers, once they graduate from seminary or divinity school, they just sort of put it back on the shelf and then go right to the pulpit because they don't talk about it there. But, I mean, legitimate scholars do. You could walk into a religious studies course in Yale or Harvard, and you'll find them teaching this stuff.
But it's not the scholars who are talking to the masses. It's not the scholars talking to the people that are going to the church. It's the preachers. It's the people who have invested interest in making you believe that everything's hunky-dory.
And I'm actually in the middle of a book about that subject right now, Jesus Interrupted by Bart Ehrman. And it's exactly that. Like, he was a fundamentalist Christian. He went to divinity school, or not divinity school, he went to, he got his theology degree. And he was a fundamentalist Christian up until he ended up as a professor. And then he was like, how do you rationalize the historical critical method and the fact that there's all these problems with it?
I guess the rationalization is a guy goes, yeah,
pretty much. I mean, you just sort of go, and
yeah, I know. That's my favorite rebuttal to any argument was when the guy goes, oh yeah.
But I mean, it's like the picture I posted up on Facebook. It's, when Jesus is behind the preacher, tell him about the time I fought the dragon. That never happened, Jesus. Tell him anyway. So in Luke 24, 1 through 12, Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James. So notice it's different people. And the other women go to the tomb in the early morning. They find the tomb empty. But there are 2 men dressed in white who then explain that Jesus was resurrected. They then go to Emmaus, which is outside Jerusalem. Again, there's no guard. Nowhere in the Gospel of Luke is there a guard. Mark 16, 1 through 8. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome go to the tomb to anoint the body sometime in the morning. The sun had already risen in this account. So it directly contradicts what John says when it was still dark.
But this one here says
they're discussing how to roll back the stone, but find it already open. A man in white explains that Jesus was resurrected and tells them they have to go to Galilee. They then flee in fear and tell no one. And Mark actually ends at verse 8. Everything after 8, verses 9 through 20, are a later addition. If you go to any of the the oldest witnesses to the Gospel of Mark, it ends at 16:8.
All right, so let me get this straight. The account of the tomb and the stone and the guard who may or may not have been there are recounted in a document that was written decades after the event by people who weren't there, and it's not even internally consistent.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is exactly it. Only in Matthew 27:62 through 28:15 are there guards at the tomb.
So
And
apparently that's the one that's true.
That's exactly. But, I mean, what about all of the other ones? What about the other 3 accounts of the thing? I mean, there is no guard there. So, I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And it seems the listener may have missed the point we're making about the claim about the empty tomb. When you read the Bible, no one claims to anyone that the tomb was empty until the Pentecost, and that's in Acts 2:1. That's 50 days after the supposed resurrection.
Well, it says here in that document that was sent to us before the show that in John 19:42, it mentions the tomb being empty. It says, Jesus' tomb near Jerusalem had the tomb. Wait, they don't even quote the whole thing, so this is. Again, we just got this document right before the show, so I haven't. But they quote John 19:42, saying that's the first time that they reference the empty tomb.
Yep. Let me jump to it really quick.
So he's actually references it in the book.
But again, these are accounts written.
Oh yeah, and John was written
They're
near
not
the end of the first
first-person
century.
accounts written decades after the event
Yeah.
did or did not occur, and they're self-conflicting. So which one is true? Who's right?
Yeah. Oh, probably none of them. Actually, John 19:42 says nothing about the tomb being empty. I just pulled it up now. It just says that the tomb was close at hand. They laid Jesus there. That's it. That's
But
it.
as you can see here, just to make sure I'm being honest with this document that was sent us. 2 is the tomb was empty, and then it references
John 19:42. Yeah.
Okay, so for people who are referencing this document and seeing that it's referencing the empty tomb, read what John 19:42 says, just so we can be straightforward with it.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with the empty tomb. And actually, it has to do with the exact opposite. It has to do with them putting a body in the tomb. It has to do with a full tomb, not an empty tomb.
I don't know, man. This is.
Well, that's what this show's for, though.
Yeah.
I mean, but like I said, I mean, it seems like they've missed the point that even like the Gospels, you can't even necessarily trust the Gospels. I mean, they're not histories; they're biographies. Like when you pick up Plutarch's Lives and you flip open to the life of Alexander, Plutarch explicitly says, I endeavor not to write history, but to write biography. Because in the ancient Greco-Roman world, biography and history were different. You had biographers and you had historians. Tacitus was a historian. Plutarch was a biographer. And a biographer would write stories about someone to expose what they were like. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for all practical purposes, were biographers. They were writing stories about someone who they thought was the Son of God, but those stories may not necessarily have been truthful, and they may have even known that. It's just those stories were used to explain who they thought Jesus was, and that was perfectly accepted literature then. In the Greco-Roman world, that was totally acceptable. Would read Plutarch's Life of Alexander or Life of Caesar. Read the lives of the 12 Caesars.
That's funny because like in today's culture, when we talk about biography, we expect it to be true. We assume that a biography is factual. God, what was the name of that guy that was on Oprah that wrote his biography? And he was the.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, he had this very good story, and he told us.
Oh, she was mad at him.
Yeah. And Oprah really endorsed his book because she took the biography to be very factual.
Yeah.
And then he was like, yeah, well, it's
Yeah,
my
yeah.
life, but I made some stuff up.
Yeah, and I mean that's
And they got people
that's
got
what,
pissed.
Yeah.
That's what biography used to be. I mean, it was very
and that's
well.
just a TV channel.
You know, we don't take Plutarch to be the authority on everything Alexander did, because frankly, a lot of the stories were just made up whole cloth. It has to do with what people thought.
Well,
Like
can you imagine if
psychology
you were,
was back then.
if you were the king and you had a biographer and he's writing some stuff?
You don't want
he's
that.
like, yeah, sire, we in this chapter you're gonna like fight a lion and maybe defeat a dragon. And the guy's like, yeah,
Like,
man, that's
yeah,
cool.
yeah,
Go with
that's
that.
awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's exactly.
I mean, yeah, that would happen now. Somebody, you're like, you're finding a dragon? Hell yeah, put that in there.
Yeah, but I mean, but now, I mean, those facts are sort of verifiable
Yeah.
at the time, right? And that's an interesting distinction. I never really thought of that, the difference between biography and history.
Yeah.
Now, is that relevant to Herodotus's accounts of history? Because he was one of those guys that was regarded as the first historian, but he was writing about events that took place much earlier than his time, the Phoenician Wars. Is it the Phoenician Wars?
The Peloponnesian War.
Is it Peloponnesian or Phoenician? Anyway, right, so Herodotus was the first historian, but even his accounts of history are not necessarily regarded as fact, even though he's regarded as the first historian. We recognize that he was telling a story, not necessarily accounting for verifiable factual events.
And I mean, he very well might have been the first person to start to diverge off of, from biography into history, because later on you start getting, better and better historians. You get Tacitus and you get Josephus and you get all of these other ancient historians who would write. So I mean, it very well, like, I'm sure the two didn't just separate like that. It very well, history could have. And history is still incredibly fucking skewed. You take history in college, and you
Yeah.
always have to study historiography, like how history is recorded. History is recorded in the eyes of the victor always.
Well, yeah, right. That's right. History is written by the victorious.
Exactly. So it always has that slight cling to the ancient biography. So, but I think we're running pretty low on time. And
I could talk about the Shroud of Turin all day long.
This is about the seal, though.
This is about the seal.
I know, but I love the Shroud of Turin. Though. I mean, the seal, I'm like, all right, come on, big deal. It's yeah. So I mean, really, the story of the seal is a not a first person account that's internally inconsistent. At the end of story. I mean, it's just
The first gospel account.
how can you
it
take
should
that
be,
as fact?
If Jesus was crucified in 30, the first gospel account was Mark, and it wasn't written until about 60, the year 60. And then Matthew and Luke weren't written until at least 75.
Let me back up real quick. Just because we're saying that the account of all this was written long after the events took place. If you
You're gonna make us
believe
go into overtime.
huh?
You're gonna make us go.
I'm
into
sorry,
overtime.
but I want to clarify because this
I
document
had nowhere to be.
Yeah, this document so apparently reflects what a majority of people think, and it says here that there were many witnesses to Jesus' appearances, and it references. This is the Apostle Paul wrote that Christ has been seen by more than 500 people at one time, and that most of the 500 are still alive when Paul was proclaiming the resurrection. So skeptics could just simply question the eyewitnesses, and they reference 1 Corinthians 15:3-6 on that.
And my rebuttal to that would be, then why didn't they? Why don't the earliest historical references to Jesus doing anything are more than a half century after the crucifixion, and the earliest ones, Josephus and Tacitus, are forgeries. So I mean, you literally don't have anyone writing about Jesus critically from like I'm going to use the term lightly because they're not really, but from a secular perspective, you don't have anything until the 2nd century, almost a century after the crucifixion.
So why are they making this claim? I mean, this is apparently a common claim. That's the only reason I'm bringing it up.
Because once again, what they're doing is they're taking a letter, which is not a history, from Paul, and they're quoting it as they're taking Paul at his word.
But Paul wrote this stuff.
Yeah, and interesting fact, Paul never knew Jesus.
Yeah. And that's referenced. I mean, I know we
Acts 9.
Okay. Just asking.
Acts 9. Paul was previously Saul of Tarsus. He was on the road to Damascus. This is after the crucifixion. He has a vision of Jesus, is blinded, and then ends up in Jerusalem where he gets healed.
Well, that's why he's blind, because he saw Jesus.
Yes.
Cool. So that didn't put us in overtime.
No.
You cleared that up pretty fast.
So, that's pretty much everything for tonight. And if you have any questions, any concerns, any outbursts, any outrage about the show, call us, contact us. The email is nonreligious@zombie-popcorn.com. You can call our hotline, which is... Jason doesn't even know.
I don't know my number. Hold on, I have it. I don't know. But
while Jason's looking that up, you can follow us on Facebook. We are facebook.com/thisnonreligiouslife, all one word. And, of course, always check out the rebroadcast, check out past episodes, and let us know what you think. Leave comments, leave feedback.
I want to plug a book for a moment. There's a guy, Joe Nickel. He's a member of PsyCop and the Center for Inquiry. He's one of the big names in skepticism, and he wrote a great book about the Shroud of Turin. That really, if you have a skeptical mind about it and want to read a skeptic's take on it, and he has lots of good arguments. And he's not a researcher, but he is a journalist with the utmost credentials. And his book is Inquest on the Shroud of Turin by Joe Nickel. And if you're looking for a good read, I suggest you pick it up.
Excellent. And that number is 757-337-2195. Again, that's 757-337-2195. And if you want to send us an email, please do at nonreligious@zombie-popcorn.com. That's nonreligious@zombie-popcorn.com.
Cool.
Don't forget to tune in every Saturday night at 7 p.m. because we have The Talking Dead. This broadcast of this non-religious life broadcast, as you know, every Thursday night at 8 p.m.
It's part of the Zombie Popcorn Media Empire.
Dun, dun, dun. Thank you and have a good night.
Good night.
Jesus got out here.
I thought I was a good Christian.
Jesus died on a cross. I go to church every Sunday. Jesus got out here. Then I read this. It says Jesus died on a cross for a rotten hooker.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday. I am a very religious person.
I thought I was a good Christian.
The very lies the serpent told to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ.